The untold truth of Mary Magdalene lies in the Vatican's deepest shadows. Wrapped in secrets, guarded behind hidden vaults and forbidden texts. For centuries, her story has lingered like incense in the silent corridors, painted in fragments across the walls of history, yet never shown whole. She was more than a witness, more than the figure they allowed her to be. And that is where the mystery begins. Picture this. A single candle flickers in the darkness. Its light falls across shelves of ancient books and scrolls. The air is cool and still, carrying the faint scent of old paper and stone. Far above, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica mark the passing hour, their sound drifting down like a memory. Tonight, we follow the quiet trail through faith and fear, past locked doors and whispered names. Before we begin, I want to invite you into our community. Leave a comment below with your current time and a prayer intention. Let's create a circle of support across time zones tonight. And if you find value in these hidden histories, subscribe and turn on notifications. We release new journeys into the Vatican's secrets every week. Now, settle in. Close your eyes. Let the story unfold. This is the story of the woman the Vatican feared, the woman whose voice they tried to silence, the woman who stood at the heart of Christianity's greatest moment, only to be written out of her own story. This is the story of Mary Magdalene, and it begins by the sea. Morning light spreads across the Sea of Galilee like honey poured slowly from a jar. The water is calm. The air carries the smell of salt and fish and wet rope. In the distance, boats drift lazily, their sails catching the first breeze of day. This is Magdala, a fishing town alive with the voices of traders and the cry of gulls. Women carry water jars on their shoulders. Children chase each other through narrow streets. The marketplace hums with the business of living. Somewhere in this bustle, she lived. Mary of Magdala. We know little of her life before the meeting that changed everything. The Gospels offer only fragments. She came from this town by the water. She had means, perhaps wealth. She traveled freely, which suggests independence unusual for a woman of her time. And she carried something, a shadow, a burden. The Gospel of Luke tells us that 7 demons had been cast out of her. We do not know what this means in the language of the first century. Was it illness? Mental anguish? Spiritual torment? The text does not say. What we know is this: she encountered Jesus of Nazareth, and her life turned like a ship catching wind. She was freed. And in her freedom, she chose to follow. Not as a spectator, not as someone healed and sent away. She became part of the inner circle. The Gospels name her again and again, more than most of the male disciples. She traveled with him from village to village. She provided for the group from her own resources. She listened. She learned. She stayed. This was radical. In a world where women were expected to remain in the background, she walked openly alongside the rabbi. In a culture where a woman's testimony was considered unreliable in courts of law, she became a witness to the most important events in Christian history. Think of her on the road to Jerusalem for that final Passover. The dust rises with each step. The sun beats down on the crowded path. Pilgrims sing psalms as they walk. There is excitement in the air, anticipation, but also something else. A tension, a sense that something is about to break. Mary walks with the others, feeling the weight of what is coming. Jesus has spoken of his death. The disciples do not understand, or do not want to. They argue about who will sit at his right hand in the kingdom. They imagine triumph, not suffering. But Mary knows. Somehow, she knows. When they reach Jerusalem, the week unfolds like a scroll being slowly unrolled. The entry into the city, the cleansing of the temple, the teachings that grow sharper, more confrontational, the authorities circling like wolves. And then, the night in the garden, the arrest, the scattering. Most of the men flee. Peter follows at a distance. then denies knowing him 3 times before the rooster crows. The others hide, paralyzed by fear. But Mary does not run. The next morning, she stands at the foot of the cross, close enough to hear each labored breath, close enough to see the blood and sweat and tears, close enough to watch the slow, brutal process of crucifixion, that Roman machinery of death designed to maximize suffering and shame. The Gospel of John places her there with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and a few other women. They cannot stop what is happening. They cannot ease the pain. But they can be present. They can witness. They can refuse to let him die alone and forgotten. This is courage forged in silence. When his body is taken down, wrapped in linen, and laid in a borrowed tomb, Mary is there. She watches where they place him. She marks the location in her mind. And when the Sabbath passes, she returns. Dawn over Jerusalem brings a stillness heavy with loss. Mary walks through streets still sleeping. She carries spices to anoint the body, a final act of love and honor. Her heart is a stone. Hope is gone. There is only grief now, and the small comfort of ritual. She reaches the garden tomb. The stone is rolled away. She steps forward, trembling. The space is empty. The linen cloths lie folded. The body is gone. Panic floods her. Has someone taken him? Stolen the body for some cruel purpose? She turns and runs to find Peter and John. They come, they see, they leave, confused and frightened, but Mary stays. She stands outside the tomb weeping, and in her weeping, she looks inside again. 2 figures in white sit where the body had been. "Woman, why are you weeping?" they ask. "They have taken my Lord," she says, "and I do not know where they have laid him." She turns and sees a man standing there. Through her tears, she mistakes him for the gardener. "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." And then he speaks her name, Mary. 1 word. Her name, and in that word, recognition floods through her like light breaking into a darkened room. "Rabboni," she cries. "Teacher." It is him, alive, transformed. The impossible has happened. He gives her a mission. "Go to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." She runs back to the disciples, breathless, her grief turned to joy. "I have seen the Lord," she tells them. In that moment, Mary Magdalene becomes the first witness to the resurrection, the first evangelist, the first to proclaim the good news that death has not been the final word. The early church will call her apostle to the apostles. She brought the message to those who would carry it to the world. In a time when a woman's testimony was dismissed, when women could not serve as witnesses in legal matters, Jesus chose her first. Above all others, this choice set her apart. And perhaps it was this very prominence that would later become a problem, because leadership in the early church was taking shape. Structures were forming. Authority was being defined. And here was a woman at the center of the faith's greatest moment, entrusted with its most important message. That morning in the garden could never be erased without erasing the truth itself. But it could be softened, reinterpreted, quietly diminished over time. And that is exactly what happened. In the days that followed the resurrection, Mary's voice carried the news to those who had scattered in fear. Some believed her at once, their hearts rising with hope. Others hesitated. Their minds struggled to accept that she, and not they, had been the first to see him. That a woman, not one of the 12, had been given this honor. The Gospel of Luke records their reaction with brutal honesty. These words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. An idle tale, the greatest truth in Christian history, and they dismissed it as women's gossip. But the truth could not be suppressed. Jesus appeared to them all. The resurrection was confirmed. And Mary's witness, however reluctantly received, became part of the foundation story. Yet even as the community formed around this truth, tensions were already present. Tensions about who could speak, who could teach, who could lead. In a world where public authority belonged to men, Mary's words stood like a stone in the river's flow, breaking patterns that had long gone unchallenged. The question was, would the river reshape itself around the stone, or would it eventually wear the stone smooth and sweep it away? The early decades after Jesus' death were a time of extraordinary fluidity. There was no single church, no fixed hierarchy, no agreed-upon canon of Scripture. What existed was a loose network of house churches scattered across the Roman Empire, each with its own practices, its own teachers, its own understanding of what it meant to follow the way. In some of these communities, women held positions of authority. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, greets Phoebe as a deacon and patron of many. He mentions Junia, whom he calls prominent among the apostles, Prisca, who taught Apollos, Mary, Tryphena, Tryphosa, and others who labored in the Lord. These were not passive followers. They were leaders, teachers, hosts of house churches. They had authority. But Paul's letters also reveal the tension this created. In 1 Corinthians, he writes that women should be silent in the churches. In 1 Timothy, a letter attributed to Paul, though many scholars doubt his authorship, the command is even stronger. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. These passages would echo through centuries, used again and again to restrict women's roles. But they also reveal something important. Women were teaching and exercising authority. Otherwise, why the need to silence them? The debate was real. The struggle was happening in real time. And at the center of this struggle was a fundamental question about the nature of the church itself. Would it follow the model of Jesus, who chose women as witnesses and messengers? Or would it conform to the patriarchal structures of the Greco-Roman world in which it was growing? The answer, as it turned out, was complicated. As the first century gave way to the second, the memory of the earliest days began to blur. The apostles were dying. The eyewitnesses were passing away. And the stories that had been told orally, passed from person to person like treasures handed down, were finally being written into the texts we now call the Gospels. But writing is an act of interpretation. Every choice about what to include and what to leave out shapes the story. Every emphasis reveals the concerns of the writer. And by the time these Gospels were being written, decades after the events they describe, the church was changing. It was growing more structured, more hierarchical, more concerned with establishing clear lines of authority that would allow it to survive in a hostile empire. And in this process, certain stories became more important than others. The Gospel of Mark, likely the earliest, mentions Mary Magdalene by name only at the crucifixion and resurrection. She is there. She is faithful. She is the first witness. But the text is sparse. It does not dwell on her. Matthew follows Mark's outline but adds small details. Luke does the same, though he also introduces the confusion that will later plague Mary's story. He mentions a sinful woman who anoints Jesus' feet early in his gospel, a woman unnamed and unconnected to Mary Magdalene. But the proximity of these stories in the text would later allow them to be merged. John's gospel, written last, gives Mary the fullest treatment. She is named first among the women at the cross. She is alone at the tomb. She has an extended conversation with the risen Jesus. She is called by name. She is sent with the message. John's gospel seems to honor her most. But even John's gospel exists within a larger narrative that is already being shaped by the concerns of a growing institution. The beloved disciple, traditionally identified as John himself, is given a special place of intimacy with Jesus. Peter, despite his denial, is restored and given the command to feed the sheep. The 12 are established as the foundation of the church. And Mary, though honored, is carefully kept within certain boundaries. She is a witness, Yes. But not an apostle in the technical sense that the 12 are apostles. She brings the message, yes. But she does not appear in the Acts of the Apostles, that story of the Church's early growth. After the resurrection accounts, she vanishes from the New Testament entirely. Where did she go? What did she do? Did she teach? Did she travel? Did she lead communities? The canonical texts are silent. And in that silence, space opened for other stories to grow. Stories that would not be preserved in the official canon. Stories that would later be labeled heretical, dangerous, forbidden. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In the 2nd century, as the Church continued to organize itself, a doctrine began to take shape that would have profound implications for Mary's memory. Apostolic succession. The idea was simple but powerful. The authority of the Church rested on an unbroken line of transmission from Jesus to the apostles, to the bishops who succeeded them. This line guaranteed the authenticity of the teaching. It protected against false teachers and competing interpretations. But this line was defined as exclusively male. Jesus chose 12 men as his apostles. They, in turn, ordained other men as bishops and elders. And so the authority passed from generation to generation, man to man, in an unbroken chain. This doctrine made sense in a world where authority was already structured this way. It gave the Church stability and coherence. It allowed bishops to claim a legitimacy that went back to the source. But it also required a certain reading of history. It required emphasizing the 12 and downplaying everyone else. It required treating the resurrection appearances to the 12 as more authoritative than the appearance to Mary. It required, in subtle ways, writing women out of the leadership story. Not entirely, not explicitly, but gradually, through emphasis and omission, through the choices made about which texts to preserve and which to let fade, the story shifted. Mary Magdalene remained in the story. She could not be removed. Her presence at the crucifixion and resurrection was too well attested, too central to the narrative. But her role began to change in the telling. She became less of a leader and more of a devoted follower, less of a teacher and more of a penitent, less of someone with authority and more of someone who had been saved from darkness. The transformation was subtle at first. In some early Christian texts outside the New Testament, Mary appears as a questioner, a seeker of wisdom. In the Gospel of Mary, a 2nd century text, she comforts the disciples after Jesus' departure and shares secret teachings he gave her. Peter objects. Did he really speak with a woman in private? Without our knowledge? Should we all turn and listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? Levi responds, Peter, you have always been hot-tempered. Now I see you contending against the woman like the adversaries. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? This exchange reveals the tension. It shows that Mary's authority was contested, that some accepted it and others resisted. It shows that the question of women's teaching was alive and urgent in the early centuries. But texts like the Gospel of Mary were not included in the canon. They were read in some communities, treasured by some groups, but ultimately rejected by the emerging Orthodox Church. By the 4th century, when the boundaries of the canon were being firmly established, these texts were being suppressed, condemned, hidden away, and with them, a version of Mary Magdalene who taught, who led, who held authority equal to the male apostles. What remained in the official story was a Mary who was faithful, devoted, chosen as a witness, but not a leader, in the same way Peter or Paul were leaders. She was important, yes, but her importance was carefully contained. Still, even this contained version might have been enough to preserve her honor. But another shift was coming, a shift that would transform her image entirely, a shift that would turn the apostle to the apostles into something else entirely, a penitent sinner, a reformed prostitute, a symbol of sexual sin redeemed by grace. This transformation did not happen by accident. It happened through a sermon, one sermon, preached by one man, in one moment of history, and that sermon would echo for more than 1,000 years, shaping how countless millions of Christians understood Mary Magdalene. The year was 591 A.D. The man was Pope Gregory I, and what he said from that pulpit would seal Mary's fate for centuries to come. Rome in the year 591 was a city of shadows and light. The empire that had once ruled the world was long gone. Barbarian kingdoms now controlled the lands that had been provinces. The city itself was a fragment of its former glory, its population reduced, its great buildings crumbling. But the church was rising. In the vacuum left by imperial collapse, the bishops of Rome had become more than spiritual leaders. They were administrators, diplomats, the only stable authority in a world of chaos. And at the head of this church sat Gregory, later called Gregory the Great. He was a man of learning and piety, a monk who had been reluctant to take the papal throne, a reformer who strengthened the church's organization and expanded its mission, a writer whose works would influence theology for centuries. He was also, like all people, a product of his time, a time when women's sexuality was viewed with deep suspicion, when the body itself was seen as a source of temptation and sin, when the ideal of virginity and celibacy had come to dominate Christian thinking about holiness. On a particular day, in 591, Gregory stood before the congregation in Rome to deliver a homily. His subject was the gospel reading for that day, a passage from Luke about a woman described only as a sinner who came to Jesus at a dinner party, wept at his feet, wiped them with her hair, and anointed them with expensive ointment. The Pharisees were scandalized. How could a holy man allow such a woman to touch him? But Jesus defended her. Her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. It is a beautiful story of forgiveness and love. The woman is not named. Her specific sins are not described. She is simply a sinner who found mercy. But Gregory, in his sermon that day, did something that would change history. He identified this unnamed woman as Mary Magdalene, and in doing so, he combined three separate women from the Gospels into one single figure. The unnamed sinner from Luke chapter 7, Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, who anointed Jesus' feet in John's Gospel, and Mary Magdalene, the witness to the resurrection, she whom Luke calls the sinful woman, Gregory declared, whom John calls Mary. We believe to be the Mary from whom 7 devils were ejected according to Mark. With these words, Mary Magdalene became a prostitute. The text never says this, of course. The Gospels never call her a prostitute. They never connect her to the unnamed sinner. They never suggest she lived a life of sexual sin, but Gregory made the connection. And once made, it could not be unmade. Why did he do this? There is no evidence that Gregory acted out of malice. He was not trying to destroy Mary's reputation. He was trying to create a powerful narrative of redemption. In his understanding, the story became richer this way. A woman lost in sin, perhaps the worst sin imaginable to the minds of that era, sexual sin. A woman so far gone that she was possessed by 7 demons, and yet she encountered Jesus and was transformed. From the depths of degradation, she became the first witness to the resurrection. It was, in Gregory's mind, a beautiful story of grace, fall and redemption, darkness and light, sin and salvation. The problem was that it was not her story. It was a story Gregory created by merging different women, by reading assumptions into the text, by allowing the prejudices of his culture to shape his interpretation. But Gregory was the Pope. His words carried authority, and once he had spoken, the interpretation spread. By the medieval period, it was simply accepted as fact. Mary Magdalene was the penitent prostitute, the reformed sinner, the woman who had lived a life of sexual excess and found redemption through tears and devotion. This image dominated everything. Artists painted her with long, flowing hair, often red, a symbol of her former passion. They showed her weeping, her eyes turned to heaven, her hands clasped in penitence. They placed her in caves, living as a hermit, doing penance for decades. In one popular legend, she spent the last 30 years of her life in a cave in the French wilderness, naked except for her own hair, eating nothing, sustained only by angels, who lifted her to heaven 7 times a day to hear the music of the celestial choirs. She became the patron saint of repentant sinners, of reformed prostitutes, of anyone seeking to turn from a life of sexual sin. Churches dedicated to her became refuges for women trying to leave prostitution. Orders of nuns took her name and devoted themselves to rescuing fallen women. On the surface, this might seem compassionate. The Church was offering hope to those society despised, showing that no one was beyond redemption. But beneath this compassion was something else. A message about women's nature, a warning about women's sexuality, a reinforcement of the idea that women, especially women with any hint of sexual agency, were dangerous and in need of control. Mary Magdalene, in this telling, was not honored for her faithfulness or her leadership. She was held up as a cautionary tale. She was the woman who had fallen, who had been consumed by lust, who had needed a man, Jesus, to save her from herself. And the implicit message was clear. This is what happens when women step outside the boundaries society sets for them. This is the danger of female sexuality unleashed. Of course, there was another message too, a message of hope. If even Mary Magdalene could be saved, then anyone could be saved. No sin was too great for God's mercy. But the cost of this message was Mary's true story. The cost was forgetting that she had been a leader, a teacher, a witness chosen above others. The cost was reducing her to her sexuality, real or imagined, and making that the defining feature of her identity. Why did this version of Mary prove so powerful? Why did it take roots so deeply in the Christian imagination? Part of the answer lies in the psychology of the medieval church. By Gregory's time, and increasingly in the centuries that followed, the church had embraced celibacy as the highest form of Christian life. Priests, monks, and nuns took vows of chastity. Marriage was acceptable for lay people, but was seen as a concession to weakness, a lesser path. In this context, sexuality itself became problematic. The body became the enemy of the spirit, and women, as the objects of male desire, became associated with temptation. Eve had caused the fall. Women were daughters of Eve. They carried the taint of that original sin in their very nature. This was not the only way to read the Christian tradition. There were other voices, other interpretations. But it was the dominant voice, especially in the monasteries where theology was developed and texts were copied. And in this world, Mary Magdalene, as penitent prostitute, fit perfectly. She was the anti-Eve. Where Eve had brought sin into the world, Mary had repented of sin. Where Eve had tempted Adam to fall, Mary had turned from temptation and devoted herself to Christ. She became a model for how women could redeem themselves from their inherent weakness. But this model required that she had fallen in the first place. It required the story of sexual sin, even though that story appeared nowhere in the actual Gospels. The transformation was complete. The woman who had stood at the cross when the male disciples fled, who had been first to the empty tomb, who had been entrusted with the message of resurrection, was now remembered primarily as a reformed prostitute. Her courage was forgotten. Her leadership was erased. Her witness was overshadowed by an imagined past of sexual excess. And this version of Mary Magdalene would dominate Christian consciousness for more than 1,400 years. In every church, in every piece of art, in every passion play performed in medieval town squares, she appeared as the weeping penitent. Artists competed to portray her remorse most movingly. Preachers used her as an example in sermons about sin and forgiveness. She became one of the most popular saints in medieval Christianity, But she was popular for all the wrong reasons. The irony is profound. In trying to honor her as a symbol of redemption, the Church had actually dishonored her. In trying to show that no sinner was beyond hope, they had made her a sinner when she was not. And in the process, they had removed from history a powerful example of female leadership in the earliest days of Christianity. Because if Mary Magdalene was primarily a penitent sinner, then she could not also be a leader and teacher. If her claim to fame was that Jesus had saved her from a life of prostitution, then her authority came only from being saved, not from her own wisdom or her own calling. She became an object of Jesus' mercy rather than a subject with her own agency and authority. This distinction matters. It matters because it shaped how women were understood in the Church for centuries. If even the most prominent woman in the Jesus movement was really just a saved sinner, what did that say about women's capacity for leadership? The message was clear. Women could be saved, but they could not lead. They could be devoted followers, but not teachers. They could serve, but not govern. And anyone who tried to point to Mary Magdalene as an example of female authority could be dismissed with a simple response. But she was a prostitute whom Jesus saved. Her authority came from him, not from herself. And he chose 12 men, not women, to be his apostles and to carry on his mission. The doctrine of apostolic succession, which we spoke of earlier, fit perfectly with this diminished version of Mary. Yes, she had been at the resurrection. Yes, she had carried the message. But she was not one of the 12. And therefore, the authority to lead the Church, to ordain priests, to govern and teach, passed through the male apostles, not through her. This interpretation would stand virtually unchallenged for over a millennium. But history has a way of surprising us. Texts that were thought lost can be found. Stories that were buried can be unearthed. And sometimes, the truth that was hidden away waits patiently in the desert sand until the day comes when it can speak again. That day came in the winter of 1945. In the Egyptian desert, not far from the town of Nag Hammadi, a farmer was digging for fertilizer near a boulder. His shovel struck something hard, a large sealed jar made of red earthenware, buried in the sand. He hesitated. Local legend said that jars like this could contain either treasure or evil spirits. He sat and considered. Then, hoping for gold, he broke the jar open. Inside were books. 13 leather-bound books, their pages made of papyrus, their text written in Coptic, the language of Christian Egypt. The farmer had no idea what he had found. He took the books home. His mother used some of the loose pages to kindle her fire. Others were given away or sold. But eventually, scholars heard about the discovery. And when they examined the texts, they realized what had been found. A library. A collection of early Christian writings that had been hidden away sometime in the 4th century, probably buried by monks to protect them from destruction. Among these texts were Gospels that had not been seen in over 1,500 years. And one of those Gospels would change everything we thought we knew about Mary Magdalene. The books found at Nag Hammadi were not like the books in your local church. They were strange, mystical, filled with ideas that seemed foreign to mainstream Christianity. They spoke of secret knowledge, hidden wisdom, spiritual ascent through multiple heavens. They portrayed Jesus not primarily as a sacrifice for sin, but as a teacher of enlightenment. Scholars called them Gnostic texts, from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. Gnosticism was a movement, or rather a constellation of movements, that flourished in the first few centuries of Christianity. It emphasized direct spiritual experience over institutional authority. It valued inner enlightenment over external ritual. And in many Gnostic communities, women played prominent roles as teachers and prophets. The Orthodox Church, as it consolidated power in the 3rd and 4th centuries, declared Gnosticism heretical. Gnostic texts were condemned, collected, and burned. Communities that held Gnostic beliefs were persecuted. By the 5th century, Gnosticism as an organized movement had largely disappeared. But before it vanished, someone had taken these precious texts, sealed them in a jar, and buried them in the desert. Perhaps they hoped that one day, when the world was ready, these voices would speak again. And in 1945, they did. Among the texts discovered at Nag Hammadi were several that mentioned Mary Magdalene. And what they revealed was stunning. In these texts, Mary was not a penitent prostitute. She was not defined by sexual sin and redemption. Instead, she appeared as a leader among the disciples, a visionary, a teacher, someone who understood Jesus' teachings more deeply than the others, someone who threatened the authority of Peter and the male disciples. The most important of these texts, for our story, are three: the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, and the dialogue known as Pistis Sophia. Let us begin with the Gospel of Mary. This text, probably written in the 2nd century, survives only in fragments. Pages are missing. But what remains is remarkable. The Gospel begins after the resurrection. The risen Jesus has given final teachings to his disciples and departed. The disciples are distraught, afraid. They do not know what to do. Mary stands up and addresses them. Do not weep and be distressed, nor let your heart be irresolute. For his grace will be with you all, and will shelter you. Rather, let us praise his greatness, for he prepared us and made us into men. Notice that phrase, made us into men. In the Gnostic understanding, this did not mean biological maleness. It meant spiritual maturity, completeness. Mary was saying that Jesus had transformed them all, regardless of gender, into full human beings capable of carrying his teaching. Peter then asks her to share any teachings that Jesus gave her privately, teachings the others did not hear. Mary agrees. She begins to describe a vision, a conversation with the Lord about the soul's ascent through cosmic powers. It is complex, mystical, the kind of teaching that requires spiritual insight to understand. But before she can finish, Andrew interrupts. He does not believe her. Say what you will about the things she has said, but I do not believe that the Savior said these things. For indeed, these teachings are strange ideas. Peter joins in, more aggressively. Did he really speak with a woman in private without our knowledge? Should we all turn around and listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? Mary begins to weep. My brother Peter, what do you think? Do you think that I have thought this up myself in my heart, or that I am lying about the Savior? Another disciple, Levi, comes to her defense. Peter, you have always been hot-tempered. Now I see you contending against the woman like the adversaries. But if the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. That is why he loved her more than us. This line cuts to the heart of the matter. Mary was not just another follower. She was beloved. She was trusted with teachings the others did not receive. She had an intimacy with Jesus that provoked jealousy and resentment. The Gospel of Mary shows us the early church in conflict. It shows us Peter, the rock on which the church would be built, refusing to accept teaching from a woman. It shows us Mary, in tears, defending her authority. And it shows us other disciples taking sides. This was not a unified, harmonious community. This was a community arguing about who had the right to teach, who had truly understood Jesus, who could claim authority. And at the center of that argument was the question of Mary Magdalene. The Gospel of Philip takes us even further. This text, also found at Nag Hammadi, is a collection of sayings and teachings rather than a narrative. It is fragmentary, difficult to interpret in places. But it contains several passages about Mary Magdalene that have sparked enormous controversy. In one passage, the text lists 3 women named Mary who were close to Jesus: his mother's sister, and his companion. Then it specifies, his companion is Mary Magdalene. The Savior loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on her. Here the manuscript is damaged. The word is missing. Most scholars who have studied the Coptic suggest the missing word is probably mouth, though some argue for forehead or cheek. We cannot know for certain, but the implication is clear regardless. Mary Magdalene was Jesus' companion. He loved her more than the other disciples. He showed her physical affection in a way that was noticed and remarked upon. The text continues. The rest of the disciples were offended by it. They said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" The Savior answered and said to them, "Why do I not love you like her? What are we to make of this?" Some have interpreted companion to mean wife. The Coptic word used, koinonos, can mean partner or spouse. In this reading, Jesus and Mary were married, and the Gospel of Philip preserves this memory. Others argue that the relationship described is spiritual, not physical. In Gnostic thought, the kiss was often a symbol of spiritual transmission, the passing of knowledge from teacher to student. The companion language refers to Mary as a spiritual partner, the feminine counterpart to Jesus in a mystical sense. The text itself seems to support this symbolic reading. It goes on to say that those who unite in the bridal chamber, a Gnostic term for spiritual enlightenment, are no longer separated, but have become one. The language is about spiritual union, not biological marriage. But the mere suggestion that Jesus might have been married, that Mary might have been his wife, was explosive. It challenged centuries of theology about Jesus' celibacy. It raised questions about the elevation of virginity in Christian tradition. It suggested that sexuality and spirituality might not be opposites, that physical love might have a place in the life of even the holiest person. For the Vatican, this was dangerous territory. Because if Jesus had been married to Mary Magdalene, then she was not just a follower or even just the first witness to the resurrection. She was his most intimate companion, his partner, his equal. And if she was his equal, then what did that say about the role of women in the Church? The Gospel of Philip makes Mary's importance even more explicit in another passage. There were three who always walked with the Lord: Mary, his mother, her sister, and Magdalene, the one who was called his companion. His sister and his mother and his companion were each a Mary. Three Marys, but one, Magdalene, is specifically called his companion, and then this stunning statement: Wisdom, who is called barren, is the mother of the angels. The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. The Lord loved Mary more than all the disciples, and he kissed her on her mouth many times. Again, the mouth. Again, the emphasis on love surpassing that shown to the male disciples. Again, Mary in a position of unique closeness. But there is more. The text connects Mary to Sophia, the figure of divine wisdom in Jewish and early Christian thought. Sophia was feminine. She was the creative power of God, the one through whom the world was made, the teacher of humanity. By linking Mary to Sophia, the Gospel of Philip was making a profound theological claim. Mary was not just Jesus' companion in the ordinary sense. She was the embodiment of the sacred feminine, the wisdom of God made manifest. In this vision, Jesus and Mary together represented the fullness of the divine, masculine and feminine, word and wisdom, Christ and Sophia. This was a theology of balance, of partnership, of the union of opposites. It was also a theology that had no place in the emerging Orthodox Church, because by the time these texts were being written, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the Church was moving in a different direction. It was emphasizing hierarchy, not equality; celibacy, not partnership; male authority, not feminine wisdom. The Gnostic vision of Mary as teacher, companion, and embodiment of Sophia threatened all of this. And so these texts were condemned. They were called heretical. They were collected and destroyed. Except for the ones that were buried in that jar near Nag Hammadi. There is one more text we must consider, the Pistis Sophia. This is a long, complex dialogue between the risen Jesus and his disciples. It was not found at Nag Hammadi. Copies survived in other collections. But it tells us much about how some early Christians viewed Mary Magdalene. In the Pistis Sophia, Mary is the primary questioner. She asks more questions than all the other disciples combined. Again and again, Jesus praises her understanding. Well said, Mary, blessed one, who will inherit the whole kingdom of the light. At one point, the other disciples complain. They tell Jesus that Mary dominates the conversation, that she does not let them speak. Jesus responds, "Let whoever is inspired among you come forward and speak." The implication is clear. Mary speaks because she is inspired, because she understands. Peter, once more, objects. "My Lord, we cannot suffer this woman, for she takes our opportunity and does not allow any of us to speak, but she speaks many times." Jesus rebukes him gently. "He whose spirit moves him, let him come forward and speak." Over and over, in text after text, we see the same pattern. Mary understands. Mary teaches. Mary is praised by Jesus. And Peter resents her. He tries to silence her. He questions whether a woman should be allowed to teach. This is not accidental. The authors of these texts were addressing a real conflict in the early church. A conflict about women's authority. A conflict that Peter, as the symbol of institutional male authority, represented. In the Gnostic communities that treasured these texts, Mary's authority was accepted. She was honored as a teacher. Her closeness to Jesus was celebrated, not diminished. But these communities lost the larger battle. By the 4th century, when the Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity and the Church gained imperial backing, orthodoxy was being defined. Councils were held, creeds were written, and a canon of Scripture was established. The 4 Gospels we know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were approved. They became the New Testament. Other Gospels, including the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip, were rejected. They were deemed not inspired by God. They were called products of heresy, distortions of the true faith, and the communities that used them were suppressed. The Mary Magdalene of the Gnostic texts, the teacher and companion, the one who understood secret wisdom, the one whom Jesus loved more than the others, disappeared from official Christianity. What remained was the Mary of Gregory's sermon, the penitent prostitute, the repentant sinner. It is impossible to say whether the Gnostic texts give us the historical Mary Magdalene. They were written a century or more after her death. They reflect the theology and concerns of their own communities. They may be as shaped by interpretation as the canonical Gospels are, but they give us something invaluable. They give us proof that the image of Mary as prostitute was not the only image in early Christianity. They show us that in some communities, she was remembered differently. She was honored differently. They show us what was lost when these voices were silenced. And they raise a question that would haunt the Church once these texts came to light again in the 20th century. What if the Church got it wrong? What if, in suppressing these texts and the communities that treasured them, the Church had suppressed an essential part of the Christian story? What if Mary Magdalene really was more than a saved sinner? What if she really was a teacher, a leader, a companion of Jesus in ways the official story never acknowledged? And if that was true, what did the Church owe to her memory? What did it owe to the women who had been told for centuries that they could not lead, could not teach, could not hold authority, because that was not the example of the early Church? These questions became urgent after 1945, because now the texts were not just condemned memories. They were physical documents that scholars could read, translate, and study. The Vatican could no longer simply assert that these stories about Mary were lies invented by heretics. The texts were real. The traditions they represented were real. And the world was ready to listen in a way it had not been for 1600 years. The silence surrounding Mary Magdalene was about to break, but the breaking would be slow. Reluctant, resisted at every step, because acknowledging the truth about Mary meant acknowledging what had been done to her memory, and it meant opening doors that the Church had kept locked for 2,000 years. December in Upper Egypt is cool and dry. The Nile flows past fields where farmers work the soil as their ancestors have for thousands of years. The desert presses close, golden and endless. In the cliffs that rise above the river, ancient tombs and caves mark the landscape like secrets waiting to be told. Near the town of Nag Hammadi, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Samman was digging for sabak, a soft soil rich in nitrates used as fertilizer. He was working near a massive boulder called the Jabal al-Tarif, a cliff face riddled with caves. His shovel struck something hard. He cleared away the sand and found a large jar, sealed with a bowl-shaped lid, made of red earthenware. It stood nearly 2 feet tall. Muhammad Ali hesitated. Local legends said that such jars could contain either treasure or jinn, evil spirits. Break the jar, and you might release either gold or a curse. He sat in the sand, weighing his options. He was a poor man. His family needed money. The possibility of gold was too tempting to ignore. He raised his mattock and brought it down hard. The jar shattered. Golden flakes exploded into the air, glittering in the sunlight. For a moment, his heart leaped. But it was not gold. It was fragments of papyrus, disturbed after more than 1,500 years of stillness. Inside the jar were books. 13 leather-bound codices, their pages made of papyrus, covered in neat Coptic script. Muhammad Ali had no idea what he had found. He could not read. These strange books in a dead language meant nothing to him. But perhaps they could be sold. He gathered them up, wrapped them in his tunic, and took them home to the village of Al-Qasr. What happened next is a story of accidents and miracles, of texts lost and barely saved, of mothers burning priceless manuscripts as kindling and scholars racing to rescue what remained. Muhammad Ali's mother, fearing the books might be dangerous or worthless, burned some of the loose pages in her oven. Others were given away to neighbors. One codex was given to a local priest. Another was shown to a traveling merchant who recognized that the books might be valuable. Slowly, through a chain of sales and exchanges, the codices made their way into the hands of antiquities dealers in Cairo. And eventually, scholars heard rumors of ancient Coptic texts appearing on the black market. By 1946, some of the codices had been acquired by the Coptic Museum in Cairo. Others remained in private hands, smuggled out of Egypt, offered for sale to collectors and institutions. When scholars finally examined the texts, they realized what had been found. A library, an entire collection of early Christian writings, most of which had been lost for over 16 centuries. 52 separate tractates, Gospels and Apocalypses and theological treatises, many of them previously known only by name or not known at all. It was one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. And buried within this library were the texts that would change everything we thought we knew about Mary Magdalene. The Gospel of Thomas, a collection of Jesus' sayings that mention Mary as a disciple worthy of transformation into a living spirit. The Sophia of Jesus Christ, a dialogue where Mary asks questions and receives teaching. The dialogue of the Savior, where Mary is called a woman who understood completely. And most importantly, the Gospel of Philip, with its explosive statements about Mary as companion, as the one Jesus loved more than the others, as the one he kissed on the mouth. When the first translations appeared in scholarly journals in the 1950s, the reaction was immediate and divided. Some scholars embraced these texts as windows into the diversity of early Christianity. They argued that the Nag Hammadi library proved that the Christianity of the first centuries was not a single unified faith but a spectrum of beliefs, practices, and communities. The Gnostic Christians who produced and treasured these texts were not heretics distorting the true faith. They were one stream among many, eventually declared heretical by the group that won the political and theological battles. Other scholars were more skeptical. They pointed out that these texts were written later than the canonical Gospels, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. They argued that the Gnostic portrait of Mary was influenced by the theological concerns of those later communities, not by historical memory. These texts told us about Gnostic beliefs, not about the real Mary Magdalene. But even the skeptics had to admit something important. These texts proved that the image of Mary Magdalene as a prostitute was not universal in early Christianity. In the communities that produced the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary, she was remembered as a leader, a teacher, someone with unique authority. The question was no longer whether Mary had been portrayed this way in some early Christian communities. Clearly, she had been. The question now was, which portrait was more accurate? The canonical Gospels that showed her as faithful follower and first witness, but said little about her role after the resurrection, or the Gnostic texts that portrayed her as teacher and companion? For the Vatican, this question was deeply uncomfortable, because both portraits challenged the narrative that had dominated for 1400 years. Even the canonical portrait, when read carefully, showed a Mary who was far more than a penitent prostitute. She was not a reformed sinner seeking forgiveness. She was a faithful disciple, a financial supporter of Jesus' ministry, the one who stood at the cross, the first witness to the resurrection, the apostle to the apostles. Gregory's conflation of Mary with the unnamed sinner had been, at best, an error. At worst, a deliberate diminishment. And if the canonical Gospels themselves contradicted the prostitute image, what did that say about 14 centuries of preaching, teaching, and art? The Vatican's first response was silence. In the decades immediately after the Nag Hammadi discovery, the Church said little publicly about these texts. Catholic scholars studied them, of course. But there was no official statement, no revision of teaching, no acknowledgement that perhaps Mary Magdalene had been misunderstood. When the texts were mentioned at all in Catholic circles, they were dismissed as Gnostic distortions, products of heretical communities, not reliable sources for understanding the historical Jesus or the historical Mary. But the world outside the Vatican was listening. The 1960s and 70s were a time of tremendous social change. The feminist movement was challenging traditional gender roles. Women were demanding equal rights, equal opportunities, equal respect, and many women were asking hard questions about religion. Why were all the priests male? Why could women not hold positions of authority in the Church? Why were they told to be silent, to be submissive, to accept their secondary status? The discovery of the Gnostic Gospels gave these questions new urgency, because here was evidence, written in the words of early Christians, that women had once held authority in some Christian communities. Here was Mary Magdalene, not as a symbol of sexual sin, but as a teacher whom Jesus loved and trusted. What if the Church's exclusion of women from leadership was not divinely ordained but historically contingent? What if it was a choice, made by men in the early centuries? A choice shaped by the patriarchal culture of the Greco-Roman world, not by the teaching of Jesus himself. These were dangerous questions for an institution built on the claim of unchanging apostolic tradition. If women had led in the early Church, if Mary Magdalene had been a teacher, and perhaps even an apostle in the fullest sense, then excluding women from priesthood and leadership was not following apostolic precedent. It was betraying it. The Vatican could not acknowledge this without calling into question the entire structure of authority that had developed over 2 millennia. And so the official response remained: these texts are not reliable. They are products of heresy. The canonical Gospels, and the tradition built upon them, are the true guide. But scholarship does not stop because it is inconvenient. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, more and more scholars, both Catholic and Protestant, began to study the Gnostic texts seriously. They learned Coptic. They analyzed the theology, They compared these texts to the canonical Gospels and to other early Christian writings. And a consensus began to emerge. The Gnostic texts, whatever their theological peculiarities, preserved genuine memories of the earliest Christian communities. They reflected debates that really happened. They showed us conflicts that the canonical Gospels only hinted at. And they showed us that Mary Magdalene's authority had been contested from the very beginning. Peter's objections in the Gospel of Mary were not inventions. They reflected a real tension in the early church about whether women could teach and lead. The Gnostic communities that honored Mary were not creating a false history. They were preserving a memory that the emerging Orthodox Church was trying to suppress. By the 1990s, this scholarly consensus was reaching the wider public. Books were published. Documentaries were made. Journalists wrote articles asking why the Church had hidden this history. And then, in 2003, a novel appeared that would bring these questions to a global audience in a way no scholarly book ever could. The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown became an international phenomenon. It sold tens of millions of copies. It was translated into dozens of languages. It sparked conversations in living rooms, book clubs, and churches around the world. The novel was fiction, and it took considerable liberties with history. But at its core was a claim based on the Nag Hammadi texts, that Mary Magdalene had been Jesus' companion, possibly his wife, and that the Church had suppressed this truth to maintain male power. The Vatican was forced to respond. Catholic scholars and officials issued statements condemning the book's historical claims. They pointed out the errors, the distortions, the difference between a novel and serious scholarship. But the damage, if it can be called that, was done. Millions of people now knew that there were other Gospels beyond the four in the Bible. Millions knew that Mary Magdalene had been portrayed differently in some early Christian texts. Millions were asking questions that would not go away. Why had the Church called her a prostitute when the Gospels never did? Why had her leadership role been erased? Why were these other texts excluded from the Bible? The Church could no longer simply ignore these questions. And slowly, reluctantly, change began. In 1969, decades before the Da Vinci Code, but after the initial impact of the Nag Hammadi discovery, the Catholic Church had taken a small but significant step. In the revised Roman Missal, the identification of Mary Magdalene with the unnamed sinner from Luke chapter 7 was quietly dropped. The Church did not announce this widely. There was no press conference, no apology for centuries of error, but in the official liturgy, Mary Magdalene was no longer conflated with the prostitute. It was a tacit admission that Gregory had been wrong. But the Church did not go further. It did not declare that Mary had never been a prostitute. It simply stopped saying she was. The change was subtle, barely noticed by most Catholics. The image of Mary as penitent sinner remained in popular imagination. The paintings, the statues, the stained glass windows in churches around the world still showed her that way. The feast day readings still emphasized her devotion and love without mentioning her leadership. The full truth about Mary Magdalene remained locked away, acknowledged by scholars but not proclaimed from pulpits. Why this reluctance? Why the resistance to telling the complete story? The answer lies in what that story would imply. If Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute but a leader, if she was trusted by Jesus with teachings and authority, if she was indeed the apostle to the apostles in the fullest sense, then the exclusion of women from ordained ministry in the Catholic Church loses its historical foundation. The argument had always been, Jesus chose 12 men as apostles. He ordained men. The apostles ordained men. This pattern, established by Christ himself, is binding for all time. But if Mary was also an apostle, if she also taught and led, if she was possibly even closer to Jesus than the 12, then the pattern is not so clear. And if the pattern is not clear, then the door opens to questions the Vatican was not ready to answer. Could women be ordained as priests? As bishops? Could a woman, in principle, be pope? These questions terrified the Vatican not because of the theology alone, but because of what they meant for power. The Catholic Church is one of the last major institutions in the Western world where women are categorically excluded from the highest levels of authority. Governments have female leaders. Corporations have female CEOs. Universities have female presidents. But the Catholic Church, with over 1 billion members worldwide, insists that only men can be priests. This position becomes harder and harder to defend as women achieve equality in every other sphere. And it becomes impossible to defend if the historical foundation crumbles. If Mary Magdalene's story proves that women did lead in the earliest church, that Jesus did trust women with authority equal to men, then excluding women is not fidelity to tradition. It is betrayal of it. This is what the Vatican truly feared when the texts from Nag Hammadi came to light. Not the texts themselves, not the Gnostic theology, not even the suggestion that Jesus might have been married. What they feared was the logical conclusion of accepting Mary's full story, that the Church had been wrong for 2,000 years, that women had been denied their rightful place, that an injustice had been committed and perpetuated, generation after generation, in the name of Christ, and that now, with these texts speaking again after 16 centuries of silence, that injustice could no longer be hidden. The jar had been broken. The books had been found. The words written in Coptic on ancient papyrus were being read by scholars around the world. Mary Magdalene was speaking again, and this time, her voice could not be silenced. Fear is a teacher. It reveals what we value most by showing us what we cannot bear to lose. And when an institution as powerful and ancient as the Vatican exhibits fear, when it responds to new evidence with silence and resistance rather than openness, we must ask, what is at stake? What would be lost if Mary Magdalene's full story were told? The answer is not simple. It is not merely about one woman or one historical correction. It is about the entire architecture of authority that has defined the Catholic Church for 2 millennia. Let us examine, one by one, the fears that kept Mary's truth locked away. The first fear: the collapse of apostolic succession. This doctrine is the bedrock of Catholic authority. The Church teaches that Jesus gave special authority to the 12 apostles, and particularly to Peter. That authority was passed down through the laying on of hands, from the apostles to bishops, from bishops to their successors, in an unbroken chain stretching from the 1st century to today. Every priest is ordained by a bishop. Every bishop can trace his ordination back through this chain to the apostles. And the apostles received their authority directly from Christ. This is why the Catholic Church claims to be the one true church, founded by Jesus himself. This is why its sacraments are valid and its teachings authoritative, because the line is unbroken. But this line, as the Church has always understood it, is exclusively male. Jesus chose 12 men. They ordained men. Those men ordained other men. Women, in this telling, were never part of the apostolic line. They were disciples, yes, faithful followers, certainly, but not apostles in the technical sense, not ordained, not given the authority to ordain others. Now imagine what happens if Mary Magdalene is acknowledged as an apostle in the fullest sense. Not just apostle to the apostles, as a poetic title, but apostle, one who was sent by Jesus, one who taught with authority, one who led communities, one who, in the Gnostic texts, is portrayed as understanding Jesus' teaching better than Peter himself. If Mary was an apostle, then the apostolic line is not exclusively male. And if the line is not exclusively male, then the argument for excluding women from ordination collapses. The Church cannot say, Jesus only chose men, because Jesus also chose Mary. He appeared to her first. He entrusted her with the message of resurrection. He, according to the Gospel of Philip, loved her more than the others. The careful structure that has supported 2,000 years of male-only priesthood begins to crack. And once it cracks, the questions multiply. If Mary had authority, could she have ordained others? If she taught, why cannot women teach today? If she led, why cannot women lead now? These questions have no good answers within the traditional framework. The only way to avoid them is to keep Mary's role carefully contained, to acknowledge her importance, yes, but never to call her an apostle in the same way Peter was an apostle. Never to suggest that she had authority equal to his. This is why the Vatican resisted the full implications of the Nag Hammadi texts, because those texts, if accepted, would undermine the very foundation of church structure. The second fear: women's ordination becomes inevitable. This follows directly from the first fear, but it is worth examining separately because the practical implications are so vast. For decades, Catholic women have been asking why they cannot be priests. The official answer has always been, because Jesus chose only men as apostles, and we must follow his example. But what if his example was different than we have been told? What if the reason we have no clear evidence of women's ordination in the early church is not because Jesus forbade it, but because the male leaders who wrote the histories chose not to record it, or because they actively suppressed it? The Gospel of Mary shows us Peter objecting to Mary's teaching. The Pistis Sophia shows us the disciples complaining that she speaks too much. These conflicts were real. And if they were real, then the exclusion of women from leadership was not Jesus' command. It was the result of a power struggle, a struggle that the men won, and then wrote into doctrine as if it had always been God's will. Acknowledging this would mean that the ban on women's ordination is not divinely mandated. It is a human decision, made in a particular historical context, shaped by the patriarchal culture of the ancient world. And human decisions can be changed. This is what the Vatican fears. Not just the theological argument, but the practical reality. If women can be ordained, then the Church must ordain them. And if women become priests, they can become bishops. And if they can become bishops, they can, in principle, become cardinals, and even pope. The entire power structure of the Church, which has been exclusively male for 2 millennia, would be transformed. Some see this as justice long overdue. Others see it as the destruction of sacred tradition. But everyone recognizes it as a revolution, and institutions, especially ancient ones, do not embrace revolution willingly. The third fear: rewriting sacred history. The Catholic Church claims continuity with the apostles. Its teaching, it says, has been consistent from the beginning. Development is acknowledged, yes. Understanding deepens. But the core truths remain unchanged. This claim of continuity is essential to the Church's identity. It is what distinguishes Catholics from Protestants, who argue that the Church went astray and needed reformation. Catholics say, "We never went astray. We have preserved the apostolic faith intact." But what happens when evidence emerges that a significant part of the story was suppressed? That for 1400 years, the Church taught something about Mary Magdalene that was false. It means the Church was wrong, seriously wrong. Not about a minor detail, but about a major figure in Christian history. And if the Church was wrong about this, what else might it have been wrong about? Pope Gregory I is venerated as a saint and doctor of the Church. His writings are considered authoritative, yet his sermon in 591, which transformed Mary into a prostitute, was based on error. How does the Church acknowledge this without undermining the authority of its saints and doctors? How does it admit that centuries of preaching and teaching promoted a false image, without opening the door to doubt about other teachings? The Vatican's solution has been to make changes quietly, to stop calling Mary a prostitute without formally declaring that she never was one, to elevate her feast day without explaining what was wrong before. This approach avoids a direct confrontation with history, but it also avoids the full truth. And in an age of information, when anyone can read the Gnostic texts online, When scholars publish their findings for mass audiences, quiet changes are not enough. People want answers. They want to know why the Church got it wrong. They want to know what else might have been suppressed or distorted. These are uncomfortable questions. And they lead to uncomfortable territory. Because if the Church rewrites Mary's story, it must also rewrite the story of how the Church itself developed. It must acknowledge that political considerations, cultural prejudices, and struggles for power shaped doctrine as much as divine guidance did. This is a more human, more fallible Church than many Catholics want to imagine. The fourth fear? The wife question. This is perhaps the most explosive aspect of the Nag Hammadi discovery. The Gospel of Philip's description of Mary as Jesus' companion, whom he loved more than the disciples and kissed often, has sparked endless speculation. Was Mary Magdalene Jesus' wife? The text does not say this explicitly. The language is ambiguous. The kiss may be symbolic, a transmission of spiritual knowledge. The companion may mean spiritual partner, not spouse. But the possibility cannot be entirely dismissed. Jewish rabbis of the first century were typically married. Jesus was called rabbi. It would not have been unusual for him to have a wife. And if he did, Mary Magdalene is the most likely candidate. She traveled with him. She was present at the most important moments. She was, in the Gospel of Philip, distinguished from all others by her closeness to him. For the Catholic Church, this possibility is theologically problematic for several reasons. First, it challenges the long tradition of celebrating Jesus' celibacy. The Church has held up Jesus as the model for priests, who are required to be celibate. If Jesus was married, this model becomes more complicated. Second, it raises questions about the Church's ambivalent relationship with sexuality and marriage. For centuries, the Church has taught that celibacy is a higher calling than marriage, that virginity is more pleasing to God than sexual union. This teaching has deep roots. It comes from the early Church Fathers, many of whom were influenced by Greek philosophy that viewed the body and its desires as obstacles to spiritual purity. But if Jesus himself was married, if he experienced sexual love, then this elevation of celibacy over marriage becomes harder to justify. The Church teaches that marriage is sacred, a sacrament, an image of Christ's love for the Church. But in practice, it has often treated sexuality as something suspect, something that must be controlled and confined. A married Jesus would challenge this entire framework. It would suggest that sexual love and spiritual perfection are not opposites, but can be integrated, that the body is not the enemy of the spirit, but part of the wholeness of being human. Third, and perhaps most significantly, if Mary was Jesus' wife, then her authority would be unquestionable. Not just as a disciple, not just as a witness, but as his partner, his closest companion, the one who knew him most intimately. In that case, the suppression of her voice and her leadership would be not merely unjust, but a betrayal of the most profound kind. The Church would have silenced the wife of Christ himself. This is why the Vatican has been so careful to deny or minimize the possibility of marriage. It opens too many doors. It raises too many questions. It threatens too much. Better to keep Mary at a safe distance. A devoted follower, a faithful witness, but not a wife. Not a partner. Not someone with authority rooted in ultimate intimacy. The fifth fear. Loss of control over the narrative. There is a final fear that underlies all the others. Once the full story of Mary Magdalene is told, once the Gnostic texts are acknowledged as preserving genuine memories, once the prostitute image is fully repudiated, the Church loses control. People will ask their own questions. They will draw their own conclusions. They will not simply accept what the Vatican says about tradition and authority. In the age before Nag Hammadi, the Church could say, "This is how it was," and most people had no way to verify or challenge that claim. But now the texts are available, scholars are analyzing them. Books are being written. Documentaries are being made. Online forums are discussing them. The narrative is no longer controlled by the institution. It is open to interpretation by anyone with access to information. This democratization of knowledge is deeply threatening to an institution that has always claimed special authority to interpret scripture and tradition. If Mary Magdalene's story proves that the official version can be wrong, that important truths can be suppressed, then people will question other teachings as well. They will ask about birth control, which the Church forbids but which most Catholics ignore. They will ask about divorce and remarriage, about homosexuality, about 1,000 other issues where the Church's teaching seems out of step with modern understanding. And they will not accept because the Church says so as a sufficient answer. This is the deeper fear. Not just about Mary, not just about women's ordination, but about the entire model of authority that places the Vatican as the final arbiter of truth. In the modern world, authority must be earned, not simply claimed. It must be based on reason, evidence, and moral credibility. Institutions that demand unquestioning obedience find themselves increasingly isolated. The Catholic Church has been navigating this tension for decades. It wants to maintain its authority while also engaging with the modern world. It wants to uphold tradition while also acknowledging that understanding evolves. Mary Magdalene's story sits at the heart of this tension. To tell her full story would be to admit error, to acknowledge suppression, to open questions about women's roles that the Church is not ready to answer. But to continue hiding her story is to lose credibility, to appear defensive and dishonest, to alienate people who can see the truth for themselves in ancient texts. The Vatican is caught between these two impossible options, and so it has chosen a middle path. Slow acknowledgement, gradual change, never admitting too much at once, never making the full apology that might be deserved. It is a strategy of managed revelation, of allowing some truth to emerge while keeping other truths locked away, of hoping that time will soften the blow, that generations will pass, that eventually the changes will seem natural rather than revolutionary. But time moves differently now than it did in the age before information technology. People are less patient. They want answers now, not in a century or two. And Mary Magdalene's story is no longer hidden in a jar in the Egyptian desert. It is out. It is being told. And with each telling, the pressure on the Vatican grows. To tell the truth, to make amends, to let Mary Magdalene speak. At last, in her own voice, not as a penitent prostitute, not as a reformed sinner, but as what she was, a leader, a teacher, a witness, an apostle, and perhaps the companion of Christ himself. Revolutions are not always loud. Sometimes they happen in whispers, in quiet decisions made behind closed doors, in small changes that accumulate over decades until one day people look back and realize the world has transformed. The revolution surrounding Mary Magdalene has been this kind of revolution. No grand proclamations, no dramatic reversals. But slowly, steadily, the ground has been shifting beneath the feet of tradition. The change began, in many ways, with an event that seemed unrelated to Mary Magdalene at all. The Second Vatican Council, Vatican II, convened by Pope John XXIII in 1962, the Catholic Church was entering the modern world, the Pope declared. It was time to open the windows, to let fresh air in, to engage with contemporary society rather than retreating from it. For 3 years, bishops from around the world gathered in Rome. They debated, they prayed, they drafted documents that would reshape Catholic life. The Mass would be celebrated in local languages, not just Latin. The laity would be encouraged to participate more actively in worship. The Church would engage in dialogue with other faiths, with science, with the modern world. It was a time of hope and upheaval. Conservatives feared that too much was changing too quickly. Progressives hoped for even more radical transformation. And in the midst of all this change, a quiet shift occurred regarding women. Vatican II did not ordain women. It did not even seriously discuss it. But it planted seeds. It affirmed the dignity of all baptized Christians. It emphasized the priesthood of all believers. It opened new roles for women as lectors, as Eucharistic ministers, as participants in parish councils. These were small changes, but they created space. They allowed women to ask, if we can do this, why not more? If we have dignity and calling, why are we excluded from ordained ministry? The questions, once raised, would not go away. In 1969, 7 years after Vatican II began, the Church made another quiet change. The revised Roman Missal, the official book of Catholic worship, dropped the identification of Mary Magdalene with the unnamed sinner from Luke's Gospel. There was no announcement, no explanation, no apology for 14 centuries of error. Simply, in the new liturgical texts, Mary was no longer called a prostitute. The readings for her feast day no longer emphasized her as a penitent sinner. Instead, they focused on her as witness to the resurrection. Most Catholics did not notice. The change was too subtle, too technical. Priests continued to preach about Mary in the old way because that was what they had been taught. Artists continued to paint her with the symbols of penitence because that was the tradition. But the official position had shifted. The Church, without quite saying so, was admitting that Gregory had been wrong. This was a crack in the wall. Small, but significant. Because if the Church could be wrong about Mary Magdalene for 1400 years, what else might it be wrong about? Scholars noticed. Feminist theologians noticed, and they began to dig deeper. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, a generation of women scholars emerged who would transform our understanding of early Christianity. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza published In Memory of Her in 1983, a groundbreaking work that reconstructed the role of women in the earliest Christian communities. She argued that women had been leaders, prophets, and apostles, and that their contributions had been systematically erased as the Church became more patriarchal. Elaine Pagels, a professor at Princeton, wrote the Gnostic Gospels in 1979, bringing the Nag Hammadi texts to a wide audience. She showed how these texts preserved memories of Christian communities where women taught and led, communities that were suppressed when orthodoxy was established. Karen King at Harvard studied the Gospel of Mary in depth, showing how it reflected real conflicts in the early Church about women's authority. These were not fringe scholars. They were professors at the most prestigious universities in the world. Their books won awards. Their arguments were taken seriously by their peers, and they all pointed to the same conclusion. The exclusion of women from church leadership was a historical development, not a divine command. It could be changed. The Vatican could not ignore this scholarship, but it also could not embrace it. In 1976, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Vatican office responsible for defending Catholic teaching, issued a declaration on the ordination of women. The document acknowledged that the question was being asked. It reviewed the arguments, and it concluded, women cannot be ordained to the priesthood. The reason? Jesus chose only men as apostles. The Church must follow his example. This is not a matter of women's dignity or capability, the document insisted. It is a matter of fidelity to Christ's will. But the document also revealed something interesting. It spent considerable time arguing against the idea that cultural factors had influenced the exclusion of women. It insisted that Jesus, if he had wanted women priests, would have chosen women apostles despite the cultural norms of his time. The fact that the Vatican felt compelled to make this argument showed that the argument was being made. People were saying, the all-male apostolate was a product of first-century patriarchy, not divine design. The document tried to close the question. Pope John Paul II, in 1994, declared the teaching on male-only ordination to be definitive, requiring full assent from Catholics. But declarations of finality do not end debates. They only reveal how urgent the questions have become. Meanwhile, in popular culture, Mary Magdalene was experiencing a renaissance. The 1980s and 90s saw a flood of books, films, and artistic works reimagining her story. Martin Scorsese's film The Last Temptation of Christ in 1988 portrayed Mary as Jesus' companion, sparking controversy and protests. Countless novels explored her life, her relationship with Jesus, her role after the resurrection. Some were historically grounded, others wildly speculative. But all of them reflected a hunger to know more about this woman who had been hidden for so long. Women, in particular, resonated with Mary's story. They saw in her a mirror of their own struggles. Silenced, misrepresented, excluded from leadership despite their gifts and calling, Mary Magdalene became a symbol for feminist spirituality. Not the penitent sinner of medieval art, but the strong woman of the Gospels. The one who stayed when others fled. The one who was trusted with the most important message in Christian history. And then came the year 2003, and the Da Vinci Code. Dan Brown's novel was not great literature. Scholars pointed out its historical errors, its misunderstandings of theology, its conspiracy theories that went far beyond what the evidence supported. But the novel tapped into something real. A sense that the Church had hidden truths. A fascination with the possibility that Jesus and Mary had been married. A feeling that women's contributions to Christianity had been erased. The book sold over 80 million copies worldwide. The film adaptation in 2006 reached an even wider audience. Suddenly, millions of people who had never heard of the Nag Hammadi library were asking questions about Mary Magdalene. The Vatican was forced to respond more directly than ever before. Catholic officials condemned the book as fiction masquerading as fact. They gave interviews explaining what the Church actually taught about Mary. They emphasized that the Gnostic Gospels were not reliable historical sources, but they also, quietly, acknowledged that Mary deserved more honor than she had received. Pope Benedict XVI, in homilies and writings, spoke of Mary Magdalene with respect. He called her the Apostle to the Apostles. He emphasized her courage and faith. He did not address the question of why she had been called a prostitute for so long. He did not apologize for Gregory's error, but he elevated her in subtle ways. And then, in 2016, came a change that seemed small but carried enormous symbolic weight. Pope Francis issued a decree elevating the liturgical celebration of Mary Magdalene from a memorial to a feast. In the Catholic hierarchy of holy days, this is a significant promotion. It places Mary Magdalene on the same level as the male apostles. The Vatican's announcement explained the reasoning. Mary Magdalene, it said, was a true and authentic evangelizer, a witness to the risen Christ, one who continued to proclaim him after his ascension. She deserved the same honor as the apostles. This was the closest the Church had come to officially acknowledging Mary as an apostle in the full sense. It was not everything that scholars and advocates had asked for. It did not reopen the question of women's ordination. It did not address the centuries of misrepresentation. But it was movement. It was recognition. It was the Vatican saying, at least partially, what many had long known. Mary Magdalene's role had been greater than tradition acknowledged. For some, this was too little too late. For others, it was an encouraging sign that change was possible. The truth is that the Catholic Church moves slowly, measured in centuries rather than years. What seems like stubborn resistance from one perspective looks like prudent caution from another. But the movement, however slow, is in one direction. Toward greater acknowledgement of Mary's importance, toward recognition of women's gifts and calling, toward a more honest reckoning with history. Will this lead to women's ordination? Many hope so. Many fear so. The Vatican insists the question is closed. But history suggests that nothing is ever truly closed. Questions that are suppressed do not disappear. They wait, like texts in a buried jar, until the time comes when they can be heard. and the time is coming, not because of a single dramatic event, but because of the accumulation of small changes. Each generation of Catholics is more educated, more questioning, more aware of alternative perspectives than the last. Each generation of women sees opportunities in the wider world that are denied to them in the Church. And some leave. Others stay and push for change from within. The Church is losing members in the developed world. Younger people especially are walking away, tired of teachings that seem rooted in outdated gender roles, frustrated by scandals and cover-ups, hungry for a spirituality that honors their questions rather than demanding silence. The Vatican sees these trends. It knows that the Church must change or risk becoming irrelevant to modern people. But how much change? How fast? And at what cost to tradition? These are the questions that haunt every discussion of women's roles, of Mary Magdalene's memory, of the future of Catholicism itself. Meanwhile, in Protestant churches, the revolution has already happened. Women serve as pastors, as bishops, as leaders at every level. Some denominations made this change decades ago. Others are still debating it. But the trend is clear. The arguments that kept women from leadership, the appeals to apostolic precedent and biblical interpretation, have been answered and set aside in much of Christianity. Only the Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches still maintain an absolute prohibition on women's ordination. This makes the Catholic position increasingly anomalous. It makes the Church look, to many observers, like a relic of patriarchy rather than a prophet of justice. But within the Church, many faithful Catholics still believe that male-only priesthood is God's will. They do not see it as discrimination but as obedience to divine design. They worry that ordaining women would be a capitulation to secular culture rather than faithfulness to revelation. This tension is not going away. It is the defining tension of contemporary Catholicism, and Mary Magdalene stands at the center of it. Because her story is the test case. If she was truly an apostle, if she taught with Jesus' authority, if she was meant to lead, then the arguments against women's ordination crumble. But if she was something other than an apostle in the technical sense, if her role, however important, was fundamentally different from Peter's, then the traditional position can be maintained. The Vatican has chosen a middle way. Honor Mary. Celebrate her. Elevate her feast day. But do not quite call her an apostle in the way that would require rethinking everything else. It is a delicate balance, and it cannot hold forever. Because the texts exist. The scholarship exists. The questions exist. And with each passing year, they become harder to avoid. The quiet revolution continues. Not with marches or manifestos, but with patient scholarship, with faithful questions, with women who refuse to accept that their calling is limited by their gender, and with Mary Magdalene herself, whose memory will not be silenced again. She is no longer the penitent prostitute. That image is dying, slowly but surely, in the Catholic imagination. She is becoming what she always was: a witness, a leader, a teacher, an apostle. And as her true story emerges, it carries implications that reach far beyond one woman's memory. It touches the heart of authority, of power, of who gets to speak for God. The revolution is quiet, but it is real, and it is not finished. There is a hunger in the modern soul, a hunger for wholeness, for balance, for the integration of masculine and feminine, not as opposites in conflict but as complementary aspects of the divine. For centuries, Western Christianity has spoken of God primarily in masculine terms: Father, Lord, King, the language of power and authority, of transcendence and judgment. This language is biblical. It is traditional, but it is not complete, because the Bible itself, when read carefully, also speaks of God in feminine terms, as a mother comforting her children, as a woman searching for a lost coin, as wisdom, Sophia in Greek, calling out in the streets, Wisdom is feminine in Hebrew scripture. She was with God at the creation. She is the master craftswoman through whom the world was made. She is the teacher of humanity, the one who invites all to her table. In the book of Proverbs, wisdom cries out. Does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? She is portrayed as a woman standing at the crossroads, offering knowledge and life to all who will listen. In the wisdom of Solomon, she is described as a breath of the power of God, a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. She is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of His goodness. This is divine feminine imagery in the heart of Scripture, not goddess worship, not paganism, but an acknowledgement that the divine transcends gender, that God contains both masculine and feminine qualities, and that the feminine is as sacred as the masculine. Early Christians understood this. They saw Jesus as the incarnation of divine wisdom. The Gospel of John's prologue, "In the beginning was the Word," echoes the wisdom literature. Jesus is wisdom made flesh. And if Jesus embodies wisdom, then the feminine dimension of the divine is present in Him. But as Christianity developed, this feminine imagery was gradually suppressed. God became exclusively Father. Christ became exclusively male, with masculinity itself taking on sacred significance. The sacred feminine did not disappear entirely. It migrated to Mary, the mother of Jesus. In Catholic devotion, Mary became the feminine face of the divine, the one who intercedes, who comforts, who embodies mercy and compassion. But Mary, the mother, was safely contained. She was virgin, pure, obedient. She was exalted precisely because she was not threatening, not claiming authority, not teaching or leading. She was the ideal woman in a patriarchal framework, honored but subordinate. What was lost was the image of divine feminine wisdom as active, speaking, teaching, as claiming authority not through purity and submission but through knowledge and power. And this is where Mary Magdalene becomes crucial, because in the Gnostic texts, Mary Magdalene is explicitly connected to Sophia, to wisdom. She is the one who understands, the one who asks questions and receives answers, the one through whom secret teachings are revealed. She represents the sacred feminine not as passive receptacle but as active seeker, not as silent virgin but as speaking prophet. This is a different model of the feminine divine, and it is a model that has profound implications for how we understand both God and humanity. Let us think about what it means to restore this dimension. First, it changes our image of God. If the divine contains both masculine and feminine, then God is not exclusively the stern father or the conquering king. God is also the nurturing mother, the wise woman, the passionate lover. This does not mean that God has gender. In traditional theology, God transcends gender, is pure spirit. But the language we use shapes how we relate to the divine. If all our God language is masculine, we unconsciously make masculinity sacred and femininity secular. We suggest that men are closer to the divine image than women are. But if we speak of God in both masculine and feminine terms, we affirm that both men and women are equally created in the divine image. That neither gender has a monopoly on representing God. That the qualities traditionally associated with femininity, nurture and wisdom and compassion, are as divine as the qualities traditionally associated with masculinity, strength and authority, and justice. This is not a new idea. Mystics throughout Christian history have intuited this. Julian of Norwich, the 14th century English mystic, spoke freely of Jesus our Mother, using maternal imagery for Christ's nurturing love. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century German abbess, had visions of divine wisdom as a feminine figure of cosmic power. These women knew something that institutional theology had forgotten, that the divine encompasses all, that to reduce God to masculine terms alone is to impoverish our understanding. Mary Magdalene's restoration helps recover this truth. Because she embodies the sacred feminine in a way that Mary the Mother cannot. She is not virgin. She is not primarily defined by motherhood. She is defined by her relationship with Jesus as student, companion, witness. She is defined by her understanding, her courage, her voice. She teaches. She leads. She proclaims. And in doing so, she shows that the feminine can be sacred without being silent, can be holy without being passive, can be close to God without being subordinate to men. Second, restoring the sacred feminine heals a wound in the human psyche. Psychology has long recognized that we all contain both masculine and feminine qualities. Carl Jung called them animus and anima, the masculine and feminine aspects of the self. Wholeness comes from integrating these aspects, not from suppressing one in favor of the other. A healthy man acknowledges and develops his feminine qualities: intuition, empathy, receptivity. A healthy woman acknowledges and develops her masculine qualities: assertion, logic, action. But in a culture that has made the masculine sacred and the feminine profane, this integration becomes difficult. Men are taught to suppress anything feminine in themselves as weak. Women are taught that their feminine qualities are inferior, that to be taken seriously they must act like men. The result is fragmentation. Men cut off from their emotional depth, women cut off from their own power. Restoring images of the sacred feminine helps heal this fragmentation. It says that the feminine is not inferior, that qualities like intuition and compassion are not weaknesses, but strengths, that there is more than one way to be strong, more than one path to the divine. When women see Mary Magdalene honored not as penitent sinner but as teacher and leader, they see themselves reflected in the sacred story. They see that their voices matter, that their spiritual insights are valid, that they are not meant to be silent and subordinate but active participants in the work of the kingdom. This has profound psychological effects. It changes how women pray, how they relate to God, how they understand their own calling. And it changes how men see women, not as temptations to be controlled, not as helpers to be protected, but as full partners in the spiritual journey. Third, restoring the sacred feminine transforms how we understand spiritual authority. The masculine model of authority is hierarchical, based on power, on clear chains of command, on obedience to those above. This model has its place. Organizations need structure, but it is not the only model, and it is not always the best model. The feminine model of authority is relational, based on wisdom, on nurturing connection, on empowering others to find their own voice. This is the model we see in Mary Magdalene's teaching in the Gnostic texts. She does not command. She shares. She does not demand obedience. She invites understanding. When Peter challenges her authority, she does not fight for dominance. She weeps at his rejection. And Levi defends her by appealing not to rank, but to the quality of her understanding. This is a different way of leading. Not weaker, but different. And the church desperately needs it. Because the hierarchical model, unchecked by other forms of authority, has produced the scandals that have rocked the Catholic Church in recent decades. When authority is concentrated in a hierarchy of men, when questioning is treated as disobedience, when those at the top are accountable to no one, abuse flourishes. The sacred feminine offers a corrective, not a replacement, but a balance. Authority that is relational as well as hierarchical. Leadership that listens as well as commands. Power that empowers rather than dominates. Mary Magdalene, as both teacher and companion, as both leader and fellow seeker, models this kind of authority. Fourth, restoring the sacred feminine opens new paths of devotion and prayer. For centuries, Catholics have prayed to Mary the Mother. They have asked her intercession, honored her as Queen of Heaven, sought her comfort in times of trouble. This devotion has been beautiful and profound for millions of people, but it has also been limited because Mary the Mother is distant from most people's experience. Few of us are virgins. Few of us give birth to God. Her purity, her unique calling, while inspiring, can also feel unreachable. Mary Magdalene offers something different. She is not virgin. She is not mother. She is a woman who encountered Christ as an adult, who followed him by choice, who learned and grew and struggled. She is closer to the experience of most believers, and that makes her accessible as a model and as an intercessor. People are beginning to pray to Mary Magdalene, not instead of Mary the mother, but alongside her. They ask Mary Magdalene for courage to speak truth, for strength to stand when others flee, for the grace to recognize the risen Christ in their own lives. They see in her a companion on the journey, someone who knows doubt and fear, who has experienced loss and confusion, who found her way by staying close to Jesus even when everything seemed lost. This kind of devotion is emerging organically, from the grassroots, as people discover Mary's true story. And it is changing how people, especially women, relate to the divine. They are finding in Mary Magdalene a saint who understands their struggles, who validates their questions, who shows them that faithfulness does not mean silence. Fifth, the restoration of the sacred feminine connects Christianity to other spiritual traditions. Nearly every religious tradition has some concept of the divine feminine. In Hinduism, the goddess appears in many forms: Kali, Durga, Lakshmi, Saraswati. In Buddhism, Tara and Kuan Yin embody compassion. In Judaism, the Shekinah is the feminine presence of God. Even in Islam, which like Christianity emphasizes God's transcendence of gender, mystics have spoken of the divine in feminine terms. And Fatima, the prophet's daughter, is honored in ways that echo Marian devotion. Christianity's suppression of the sacred feminine has made it seem out of step with this universal human intuition. It has made the faith appear more patriarchal, more hostile to women than perhaps it needs to be. By restoring Mary Magdalene and reclaiming the wisdom tradition in Scripture, Christianity can enter into dialogue with other faiths about the sacred feminine. It can show that this is not foreign to Christian tradition but rooted in its deepest sources. This matters in an increasingly pluralistic world. It opens possibilities for interfaith understanding. It shows that beneath the differences of dogma and practice, there is a shared human experience of the divine, as both Father and Mother, as both transcendent power and intimate presence. Finally, restoring the sacred feminine is not about replacing the masculine, it is about balance. We do not need to stop calling God Father. We do not need to reject the masculine imagery that has sustained faith for millennia. We need to add to it, to expand our language, to make room for both: God as Father and Mother, Christ as King and wisdom, the Spirit as both power descending and life nurturing, and in the communion of saints, not just male apostles and martyrs, but women who taught and led and gave their lives, not just virgins and mothers, but women of every state of life, including those like Mary Magdalene who walked beside Jesus as companions and friends. This is not diminishment. It is enrichment. The faith becomes fuller, not weaker. The tradition becomes deeper, not shallower. When Mary Magdalene's voice is restored, it does not silence Peter's voice. Both can speak, both can teach, both can lead. And together, they show us a Christianity that is whole, that honors all people, all gifts, all ways of being human. This is what the restoration of the sacred feminine means. Not a new religion, not a rejection of tradition, but a recovery of what was always there, waiting to be rediscovered. Mary Magdalene is the key that unlocks this door, because her story, when fully told, reveals the sacred feminine at the heart of the gospel. She is wisdom, seeking understanding. She is love, remaining faithful. She is voice proclaiming truth. And in her, we see not only what was, but what could be. A church where women's voices are heard, where feminine qualities are honored as sacred, where authority is balanced by wisdom, power by compassion. A church that reflects the fullness of the divine image, masculine and feminine together. This is the vision her restoration offers. And it is a vision the world desperately needs. Imagine a day not far from now. The morning light falls across St. Peter's Square. Pilgrims gather, as they have for centuries, drawn by faith and curiosity to the heart of the Catholic world. The bells ring, the fountains splash, and inside the Vatican, a decision has been made. An announcement is prepared. The Church, after years of study and prayer, after decades of scholarship and dialogue, is ready to speak with a new voice about Mary Magdalene. Not merely to elevate her feast day, as Pope Francis did, not merely to stop calling her a prostitute, as happened quietly in 1969, but to make a full, unambiguous statement about who she was and what she means. Mary Magdalene, the announcement will say, was an apostle. Not merely in the poetic sense of being sent with a message, but in the fullest sense of the word. She was chosen by Christ. She was taught by Him. She witnessed His resurrection. She proclaimed the gospel. She led communities of believers. She was, in every way that matters, equal to the 12. The Gospel of Philip, long dismissed as heretical, will be acknowledged as preserving genuine memories of the early community. Not infallible, not canonical, but valuable. A window into how some early Christians understood Mary's role. And the Church will say what it has never quite said before: we were wrong. For 1400 years, from Gregory's sermon until now, we diminished this woman. We erased her leadership. We made her a symbol of sexual sin when she was a symbol of faithful courage. We are sorry. This is the future many hope for. A future of acknowledgement and healing. A future where truth matters more than institutional pride. Will it happen this way? Perhaps not with such clarity or speed. The Vatican moves slowly, speaks carefully, avoids dramatic reversals. But in some form, some version of this reckoning is coming. Because the trajectory of history bends toward truth, even when institutions resist. Let us imagine what this future might look like, not as prophecy, but as possibility, as a vision of what could be if courage overcomes fear. In this imagined future, the change begins with scholarship. The Vatican's own biblical scholars, trained in the best universities, applying the most rigorous methods, will produce a document, a comprehensive study of Mary Magdalene in Scripture and tradition. The document will be technical, careful, academic, but its conclusions will be clear. The conflation of Mary Magdalene with the unnamed sinner was an error. The evidence does not support it. Gregory's sermon, while influential, was based on faulty exegesis. Mary Magdalene, in the canonical Gospels, is portrayed as a leader among Jesus' followers. She is named more than most of the male disciples. She is present at the crucial moments. She is entrusted with the resurrection message. The Gnostic texts, while not canonical, reflect genuine conflicts in the early Church about women's authority. They show that Mary's leadership was contested, which means it was real. They preserve memories that the canonical texts only hint at. The document will stop short of declaring Mary Magdalene the wife of Jesus. That question, it will say, cannot be definitively answered with the available evidence. The Gospel of Philip's language is ambiguous. It may refer to spiritual union rather than physical marriage. But the document will not dismiss the possibility either. It will leave the question open, acknowledging that Jesus' marital status is uncertain, that first-century Jewish rabbis were typically married, that the Church's emphasis on his celibacy may reflect later theological concerns more than historical memory. This document will be released quietly at first, presented to bishops, discussed in seminaries and universities, allowed to percolate through the Church's intellectual life, and then, perhaps 5 or 10 years later, will come the official statement. A liturgical revision, new readings for Mary Magdalene's feast day, that emphasize her as teacher and leader, not merely as witness, prayers that invoke her wisdom, prefaces that call her apostle without qualification, and a pastoral letter from the Pope addressed to all Catholics, explaining the change. The letter will be pastoral, not defensive. It will acknowledge the harm done by centuries of misrepresentation. It will honor the women who have borne the burden of this error, who have been told they cannot lead because that is not the tradition, when in fact the tradition, rightly understood, includes women's leadership from the beginning. The letter will not immediately announce women's ordination. That step, if it comes, will come later, after more years of discernment and debate. But the door will be open, because once Mary Magdalene is acknowledged as an apostle in the full sense, the theological argument against women's ordination loses its foundation. How will the faithful respond? Some will rejoice, especially women who have felt called to priesthood, who have watched men with less dedication and less wisdom receive ordination while they are told their gifts cannot be used. They will see this as vindication, as justice delayed but finally arriving. Some will be confused. Ordinary Catholics in the pews, who learned in childhood that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute saved by Jesus, who never questioned that story because they trusted what the Church taught. They will wonder why they were not told the truth before. They will struggle to integrate this new image with the old one they have carried for so long. Some will resist. Traditional Catholics who believe that any change in teaching is a betrayal of sacred tradition, who fear that if the Church was wrong about this, it might be wrong about other things, who see in this acknowledgement the beginning of a slide toward Protestantism, toward relativism, toward the dissolution of everything they hold dear. The Church will have to minister to all these groups, to celebrate with those who rejoice, to teach those who are confused, to dialogue with those who resist. It will not be easy. There will be pain in this transition. Communities will divide. Some will leave the Church, convinced it has abandoned truth. Others will leave because the change did not go far enough. Too little too late. But slowly, over years and decades, a new understanding will take root. Children will grow up learning that Mary Magdalene was an apostle. They will see her in stained glass windows, not with the symbols of penitence but with the symbols of teaching. A book, a scroll, her hand raised in blessing. Artists will create new icons. Mary Magdalene standing in the garden, the risen Christ before her, light radiating from both of them. Mary Magdalene surrounded by disciples, teaching, gesturing, her face animated with understanding. Theologians will write about the sacred feminine with new freedom, drawing on Mary Magdalene as a model. They will explore what it means that Jesus chose to reveal himself first to a woman, what it says about the kingdom of God that traditional hierarchies are overturned. Preachers will tell her story without apology. They will speak of her courage, her faithfulness, her insight. They will hold her up as an example not just for women but for all believers. Because what she teaches us is not about gender alone. It is about staying present in darkness, about not running when others run, about being willing to see what is new, even when it contradicts everything you expected. And gradually, the question of women's ordination will move from impossible to inevitable. Not immediately, not without resistance, but the logic, once Mary is acknowledged as apostle, becomes inescapable. If she could teach, why cannot women teach today? If she could lead, why cannot women lead now? If she held authority, why are women denied authority? The only answer has been, because Jesus chose 12 men, but if he also chose Mary, if she too was sent, if she too was an apostle, then the pattern is not so clear. First will come women deacons. The diaconate, which existed in the early church and included women like Phoebe, whom Paul commends, will be restored. Women will be ordained to preach, to baptize, to assist at the altar. This will be presented as a return to tradition, not an innovation. And it will be the first breach in the wall. After women deacons, perhaps a generation later, will come women priests. The arguments will have worn thin by then. The lived experience of women deacons serving faithfully and fruitfully will make the distinction harder to maintain. And one day, perhaps 50 or 100 years from now, there will be a woman celebrating Mass, breaking bread, lifting the cup, speaking the words of consecration in her own voice, and it will feel not like revolution but like restoration. Not like something new but like something very old finally coming home. This is one possible future. Not guaranteed, not inevitable, but possible. And Mary Magdalene stands at the threshold of this future, just as she stood at the threshold of the tomb on that resurrection morning. In this imagined future, the change in the Church will ripple outward, affecting not just Catholics but all Christians. Protestant churches that have already ordained women will feel vindicated. They will say, "We were right to do this. We were ahead of the Catholic Church in recognizing women's gifts." But they will also recognize that the Catholic Church's deep engagement with tradition, its slow, careful process, has produced a richer theological articulation of why women's ordination matters. Orthodox churches, which still resist ordaining women, will face new pressure. If even Rome, the most traditional of Western churches, has made this change, how can they continue to defend the all-male priesthood? Some will resist more fiercely, seeing the Catholic change as capitulation to secular culture. Others will begin their own process of discernment, asking whether the Orthodox tradition, like the Catholic, has preserved some voices while suppressing others. And beyond Christianity, the restoration of Mary Magdalene will change interfaith dialogue. Muslims and Jews, observing how Christianity has recovered the sacred feminine, may look more deeply into their own traditions. The veneration of Fatima in Islam, the Shekinah in Jewish mysticism, the prophetesses of ancient Israel. Every tradition has stories of women who spoke for God, who led communities, who held spiritual authority. And every tradition has also suppressed these stories to varying degrees. Mary Magdalene's restoration may inspire others to recover their own hidden voices. But this future, hopeful as it is, will not come without cost. The process of change will hurt. People will feel betrayed by the institution they trusted. Faith will be shaken. Communities will fracture. Some priests and bishops who have spent their lives defending male-only ordination will struggle to accept the change. Some may leave ministry rather than adapt. Others will experience it as liberation, finally able to acknowledge what they have quietly believed for years. And women, who have borne the burden of exclusion, will not simply rejoice. Many will be angry, rightfully angry, at the centuries wasted, at the generations of women who had gifts for ministry but were denied, at the suffering caused by theological error baptized as divine will. The Church will have to hold this anger, acknowledge it, not dismiss it as ungrateful or inappropriate. The anger is holy. It is the anger of God at injustice. And only by passing through this anger, sitting with it, learning from it, can the Church emerge into something new. In this future, Mary Magdalene will become what she was always meant to be. Not a marginal figure defined by her supposed sin, but a central figure who helps us understand the gospel itself. Because her story is the gospel in miniature, she experiences darkness and liberation. She follows Jesus at cost. She remains faithful when others abandon him. She is the first to see the resurrection. She carries the message. And in all of this, she shows us what discipleship means. Not perfection. Not sinlessness. Not being chosen because we are already worthy, but being chosen despite our brokenness. Being healed and then becoming healers. Being loved and then learning to love. Being sent even when we feel inadequate. This is the gospel. And Mary Magdalene embodies it. When her full story is told, when she takes her rightful place in the communion of saints, the gospel itself will seem richer, deeper, more complete. Not because we have added to it, but because we have finally seen what was always there. And perhaps this is the greatest gift of Mary Magdalene's restoration. Not just justice for one woman or opportunity for others, but a fuller vision of the kingdom of God, a kingdom where the last are first and the first last, where the stone rejected becomes the cornerstone, where those who mourn are comforted and those who hunger are filled, where a woman standing in a garden at dawn, weeping for her lost teacher, becomes the first witness to God's greatest miracle, where power is redefined not as domination but as service, where authority is measured not by rank but by love, where leadership means not commanding others but empowering them to find their own voice. This is the world Mary Magdalene points toward. Not a world she creates, but a world already being born in the resurrection she proclaimed. And when the Church finally, fully embraces her, it will be embracing its own deepest truth, that in Christ there is neither male nor female, that all are one, that every voice matters, that the Spirit blows where it will, speaking through whom it chooses, and that sometimes, often, the Spirit chooses those the powerful have overlooked. This is the future unveiled, a future where Mary Magdalene is no longer feared but celebrated, where her story is no longer hidden but proclaimed, and where the Church she served, the Church that silenced her for so long, finally says what should have been said from the beginning. Thank you. We see you now. We hear your voice. And we will not forget again. In the end, every story is about what endures, what remains when the voices have fallen silent, when the conflicts have faded, when centuries have passed and the world has changed beyond recognition. Mary Magdalene has endured. Through 1,400 years of being called a prostitute, she endured. Through being painted as penitent, depicted as weeping, reduced to a symbol of sexual sin and divine mercy, she endured. Through having her leadership erased, her teaching forgotten, her voice silenced, she endured. And now, as the truth about her slowly emerges from the desert sand and the dusty archives, we begin to understand what has endured and why it matters. Her legacy is not one thing but many. Let us consider them one by one, like turning a jewel to see how light catches each facet differently. First, she teaches us about courage. Real courage. Not the courage of the battlefield or the public square, but the courage of staying present when everything you love is being destroyed. She stood at the cross. Think about what that meant. To watch someone you love die slowly, brutally, publicly, to be unable to help, unable to stop it, unable even to comfort, because the soldiers stand between you and him. Most of us, faced with such horror, would turn away, would run, would find anywhere else to be because the pain of witnessing is too great. But Mary stayed. She watched. She witnessed. She did not look away. This is a courage we all need. The courage to be present in darkness, the courage to stay when staying is agony, the courage to witness suffering we cannot prevent. In our own lives, we face moments when someone we love is in pain we cannot fix, illness we cannot cure, grief we cannot erase, struggles we cannot resolve for them. Mary teaches us to stay anyway, to be present, to witness, to let our presence say what words cannot. You are not alone. I am here. I will not abandon you. This is the courage of accompaniment, and it is sacred. Second, she teaches us about faithfulness. After the crucifixion, hope was dead. The movement Jesus had started seemed finished. His followers scattered, hiding in fear that they would be arrested next. There was no rational reason to go to the tomb on Sunday morning. Jesus was dead. The Romans were watching. It was dangerous. But Mary went anyway, not because she expected resurrection. The Gospels are clear that no one expected that. She went to anoint a corpse, to perform a final act of love for someone who would never know, never thank her, never return. She went because love does not calculate, Faithfulness does not require hope of reward. In our therapeutic culture, we are often told to set boundaries, to protect ourselves, to walk away from relationships that do not serve our needs. And sometimes, this is wise. There are relationships that harm us, that we must leave for our own survival. But there is also a deeper wisdom in staying, in being faithful not because it benefits us, but because love itself is the benefit. Mary shows us this kind of love. Love that persists beyond death. Love that serves without expecting return. Love that is its own reason. Third, she teaches us about recognizing the sacred in unexpected places. When Mary encountered the risen Jesus, she did not recognize him at first. She thought he was the gardener. Only when he spoke her name did she know him. Why did she not recognize him immediately? Perhaps because resurrection was so far beyond her expectation that she could not see what was right in front of her. Perhaps because profound transformation can make even the familiar seem strange. But when he spoke her name, everything changed. How often do we fail to recognize the sacred because we are looking in the wrong place or expecting the wrong form? We look for God in churches and mountaintops, in dramatic moments and clear signs. But God appears in gardens at dawn, in the voice speaking our name, in the stranger whose face we have not yet learned to see. Mary teaches us to stay alert, to listen, to be willing to have our expectations overturned. The sacred does not always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it looks like a gardener in the early morning light. Fourth, she teaches us about the power of witness. Mary could not make the resurrection happen. She did not raise Jesus from the dead. She was not the source of the miracle, but she was the witness. And her witness mattered, because without witnesses, events disappear into silence. Without someone to see, to tell, to proclaim, even the most extraordinary occurrence might as well not have happened. Mary saw, and she told, and the telling changed the world. In our own time, we are called to be witnesses to what we have seen of love's persistence, of justice breaking through, of grace appearing in unexpected places, of resurrection in small and large ways. The world needs our witness, not our arguments, not our proofs, but our testimony. This is what I have seen. This is what I have experienced. This is how love has transformed me. Mary shows us that witness is enough. You do not have to be the miracle. You only have to see it and speak it. Fifth, she teaches us about the danger and necessity of women's voices. Why was Mary's leadership erased? Why was her teaching forgotten? Why was she transformed from apostle to prostitute? Because her voice was dangerous. It threatened the structure of authority that men were building. It suggested that women could teach, could lead, could hold power. And so it had to be contained, redirected, made safe by redefining her as someone who was saved, not someone who saves, someone who receives, not someone who gives. But voices, once heard, are hard to silence completely. They echo, they persist in memories and texts and traditions that resist official control. Mary's voice has echoed through 2,000 years. And now, finally, it is being heard clearly again. This matters for all women who have been told to be quiet, to stay in their place, to accept that their insights, their questions, their leadership are inappropriate or unwelcome. Mary says, speak anyway. Your voice matters. Your witness is needed. Do not let anyone convince you that being female makes you less capable of understanding, of teaching, of leading. And she says this not as a feminist slogan imported from modern politics, but as an echo of Jesus' own choice. He listened to women. He taught them. He appeared to Mary first. He sent her with the message. If we honor Jesus, we must honor his choice. We must listen to the voices he chose to amplify. Sixth, she teaches us about love beyond categories. Whether Mary was Jesus' wife, as some texts suggest, or his student and friend, as others portray. One thing is clear: their relationship was profound, intimate, transformative. Jesus loved her. The texts say this again and again in different ways. He loved her more than the others. He kissed her. He taught her privately. He trusted her. What kind of love was this? Romantic? Spiritual? Both. Something that transcends our categories. Perhaps the question itself is wrong. Perhaps love at its deepest does not fit into boxes labeled romantic or platonic, spiritual or physical. Perhaps what Jesus and Mary shared was simply love in its fullness. Love that includes mind and heart, body and spirit. Love that is both intimate and universal. Love that is particular to this relationship yet reveals something true about all relationships. In our culture, we tend to divide love into types. Eros, romantic love; philia, friendship; agape, divine love. As if these are separate things. But at the highest expression, love is whole. It does not divide. It embraces all dimensions of being human. Mary and Jesus, whatever the nature of their relationship, show us this kind of love. And in showing it, they make love itself sacred. Not just spiritual love, not just selfless love, but real love, with all its complexity and depth and intensity. Seventh, she teaches us about patience and the long arc of justice. Mary's truth was buried for 16 centuries. 1,600 years of being misrepresented, of having her story told wrong, of being made into something she was not. How many people lived and died in those centuries, never knowing the real Mary? How many women were told they could not lead, could not teach, could not have authority, because that was not the tradition, when in fact, Mary had done all those things. The injustice is staggering, and it is not yet fully corrected, but the truth is emerging, slowly, imperfectly, with resistance at every step. But it is emerging. This teaches us something about justice. It does not always come quickly. Sometimes it takes generations. Sometimes those who fight for it never see the victory. But the arc bends. Slowly. Yes, but it bends. Mary waited 1,600 years for her story to be told rightly. And it is being told now. Not completely. Not everywhere. But more truly than it has been told in a very long time. For those of us working for justice in our own time, for women's equality or racial justice or the rights of the marginalized, this is both sobering and encouraging. Sobering because we may not see the full fruit of our work. We may labor all our lives and still leave the work unfinished. But encouraging because the work is not futile. Seeds planted today may bloom generations from now. Truth buried today may be unearthed centuries hence. The arc bends toward justice. And every act of witness, every claim of truth, every refusal to accept injustice, helps bend it. Finally, Mary teaches us about resurrection itself. Not just Jesus' resurrection, though she witnessed that, but resurrection as a pattern, a principle, a promise. What is dead can live. What is buried can emerge. What seems lost can be found. Her own story is a resurrection story. Buried under centuries of misrepresentation, her true identity is rising. The apostle emerges from the tomb of the prostitute. The teacher speaks again after centuries of silence. And if her story can be resurrected, what else can rise? What in our own lives do we think is dead beyond recovery? What relationships, what dreams, what parts of ourselves have we buried and mourned? Mary whispers, "Wait. Watch. The stone may yet roll away. What you think is ending may be transformation. Resurrection is God's habit. Death is never the final word. The darkness before dawn is real, but dawn comes. This does not mean everything lost returns unchanged. Jesus' resurrected body was both the same and different. He could be touched, but could also appear and disappear. He bore his wounds, but was no longer limited by them. Resurrection transforms. It does not simply restore. What returns is more than what was lost. Mary Magdalene, resurrected in our understanding after 16 centuries, is not exactly the woman who walked in Galilee. We cannot fully know her. Too much has been lost, too much has changed. But what emerges is enough. Enough to teach us. Enough to inspire us. Enough to change how we understand the gospel and the church and ourselves. And in the end, perhaps that is her greatest legacy. Not what we know about her, but what she helps us know about ourselves. That we all stand in gardens at dawn, weeping for what we have lost. That we all mistake the sacred for the ordinary until grace opens our eyes. That we all are called to be witnesses to resurrection we did not cause and cannot control. That faithfulness matters more than certainty. That presence matters more than understanding. That love matters more than being right. Mary Magdalene, apostle to the apostles, first witness of the resurrection, beloved companion, teacher of wisdom. Her voice, silent for so long, speaks to us still. Not from ancient texts alone, though we are grateful for their witness, but from the place where all true teaching comes from, the heart that has loved deeply, the soul that has endured darkness, the spirit that has seen dawn break and known, with absolute certainty, that death is not the end. She stands at the threshold between night and morning, between despair and hope, between the old world and the new. And she calls to us, as she called to the first disciples. I have seen the Lord. Come and see for yourselves. The stone has been rolled away. What you thought was ending is beginning. What you thought was lost is found. Come to the garden. The light is rising. And love, which you thought had died, is alive and calling your name. This is her legacy. Not doctrine or dogma, but invitation. To see, to witness, to believe that resurrection is not a distant hope but a present reality, and to live as people who know that the darkness, however deep, does not have the final word. May her courage inspire your courage. May her faithfulness strengthen your faithfulness. May her witness embolden your witness. And may you, like her, discover that when you stand in the darkest hour before dawn, when you remain faithful, even when hope seems dead, you position yourself to be the first to see the light. Good night, dear listener. May her story rest in your heart as you rest your head. May her voice whisper through your dreams. And may you wake, like her, to resurrection. Thank you for journeying with me through the hidden history of Mary Magdalene. For 2 hours and 30 minutes, we have walked together through shadows and light. Through centuries of silence and the slow emergence of truth, we have stood with her at the cross, at the tomb, at the threshold of resurrection. If her story has touched you, if it has opened your eyes to hidden histories or deepened your faith, I would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Mary's story resonated most deeply with you? How does knowing her true story change how you understand your own? And if you have not already, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Each week, we explore another secret the Vatican has kept, another story that has been waiting to be told. From the Gnostic Gospels to the hidden archives, from ancient heresies to modern cover-ups, we journey together into the places where faith and history intersect. Next week, we will explore the Vatican's secret relationship with the Knights Templar and what really happened when the order was destroyed. You will not want to miss it. Until then, may your dreams be peaceful. May your questions find answers. May your faith deepen in unexpected ways. And may you, like Mary Magdalene, have the courage to stay when others flee, the faithfulness to love beyond death, and the grace to recognize the sacred when it speaks your name. Sleep well, and remember, the truth, once buried, always finds a way to rise. Good night.